Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching Break the Fake. They make them, we break them, and tell you everything you need to know. Russia seems to have decided that Africa is not a continent with 1.3 billion people, but a convenient testing ground for imperial games, where it can simultaneously practice violence, geopolitical blackmail, and the search for new ways to export chaos. And although the Kremlin calls it a strategic partnership, in practice it turns out to be a kind of toxic symbiosis, official rhetoric about brotherhood of peoples, plus actual actions reminiscent of horror movies, actually. In Mali, new cases of crimes against civilians committed by the so-called African Corps, the successor to the infamous Wagner PMC, now with a new coat of paint, are being discovered as we speak. Western media have been reporting on the following: sexual violence, torture, beheadings, and mass attacks on the civilian population. In other words, everything that Russia usually calls a mission of peace and stability. If this is what peace looks like, then what does war look like? Due to Russia's so-called friendly assistance, tens of thousands of civilians are fleeing Mali to neighboring countries. New migration flows are forming, which may well reach Europe. Another gift from the Kremlin to the West, I suppose, especially since that wouldn't be the first time Russia has weaponized migration. Meanwhile, the Russian media proudly proclaim that the presence of the Corps is a blessing. For whom exactly? Well, that is an open question. Statistics speak louder than propaganda. Since 2023, more than 5,000 civilians have been killed in Mali. Experts suggest that this figure is significantly underestimated, though. According to various estimates, 46% of those killed were victims of attacks involving Russian groups, the Wagner Group and the African Corps. In other words, almost every second civilian killed is the result of the so-called stabilizing forces that the Kremlin officially presents as military instructors. It's like calling a chainsaw a manicure tool. Now, Russia likes to hide behind cultural programs, educational initiatives, and historic friendship. In reality, it looks like this. Countries are forced into cooperation with Moscow. The Russians create dependence in the security and economic spheres. They undermine their sovereignty. They promote radical narratives. They use the territory as a testing ground for hybrid warfare. And the Kremlin is acting according to the old scheme in all this. Your sovereignty is our temporary difficulty. The situation in Mali proves once more that Russia does not just export propaganda, it exports violence. It enters under the banner of friendship and leaves behind destroyed communities, new waves of refugees, and yet another region of instability. While the civilized world invests in development, education, and security, the Kremlin invests in chaos, private military companies, and the export of torture. And this is definitely not the kind of influence that Africa is asking for. It is the kind that the continent needs to defend itself against. And that's before we even note how Russia chose to rename the Wagner Group. The African Corps? I'm sure you did not see that coming. A forum for veterans of the special military operation, read War of Aggression against Ukraine, obviously, was held in Moscow, complete with the eloquent promotional catchphrase, "Together we will win." Victory, however, in this context looked more like, "Together we will defeat sober common sense." And that is because the main star of the show was Maxim Bakharov, a soldier who lost all his limbs in the war and now demands that Russian society be proud of people like him and of what they did.
Я хочу вас всех поблагодарить, кто сидит здесь в зале, тех ребят, которые там сейчас находятся, те, кто ушли от нас. Вы оплот нашей страны, вы плечи. И в связи с этим надо, конечно, менять историю отношения к воинам. Потому что мы знаем, после Великой Отечественной немножечко военные они были так в стороне, их заслуги где-то отдельно почитались, но не так, как должно быть. Мы должны гордиться тем, что наша страна живет свободной. И в этом направлении нашему социальному окружению нужно показывать нас не с точки зрения, там, допустим, инвалидности или какие мы есть, а действительно вы герои. Вы должны гордиться своим подвигом, и мы должны уважать ваш подвиг, все, кто нас окружает. К сожалению, сейчас пока еще этого не происходит. Очень много в социуме у нас странных взглядов, странных вопросов. Это тоже большая работа, чтобы мы жили также на уровне, также на той же самой волне, что живет страна. Поэтому большое вам спасибо. Когда задают вопрос, кто такая Россия, да, что такое Россия, для меня правильный ответ – это я. Это каждый из нас. Спасибо. Это мы держим на своих плечах страну. Спасибо, брат, спасибо.
Now, on stage, Bakharov complained that Russians do not show proper pride for veterans of the war against Ukraine. He said that people ask strange questions. Well, of course. In a society that lives between news about revolutionary superweapons, the Russian victories in name only, and videos from the meat grinder in Avdiivka, strange questions can indeed arise. For example, why don't people who return without limbs receive proper medical care, but instead are given a decorative role at the forum like this one, right? Why does the country reward a feat that looks like something out of a textbook, an unrealistic propaganda with pretty words instead of proper rehabilitation? And most importantly, why did all this become possible in the first place? Bakharov clearly believes in his mission. He says that Russia lives freely thanks to people like him. Now, this is interesting because if Russia today is him, as he himself has stated, then the picture is symbolic in all the wrong ways possible. It means Putin's Russia in 2025 is effectively a damaged nation smiling through the pain to appease the regime at the top, a nation that demands respect for its sacrifices, yet unable to reflect on how these sacrifices could have easily been avoided and how they were made in the most unjust cause imaginable. And at the other end of the spectrum, it is quite shocking. And it is shocking because the regime itself is weaponizing the trauma of all those troops, those who experienced wartime horror firsthand. And all this to prevent any sort of reflection, such as, why are we even doing this? From bubbling up to the surface and stirring up trouble across Russia. The Russian economy is once again demonstrating its trademark stability, the kind where the numbers have a tendency to move in a very stable way, admittedly, in one particular direction, just not the one the government was hoping for. In November, the average price of Urals crude oil, the main export product and budget lifeline, fell to $44.87 per barrel. These figures come directly from Russia's own Ministry of Economic Development, reported by the Moscow Times. Now, Moscow calls it a temporary fluctuation. Everyone else calls it a slow-motion car crash. Compared to October, Urals lost almost $9, or 18%, on the barrel. The cause isn't a mystery at all. Sanctions imposed by Donald Trump's administration that struck Rosneft and Lukoil are to blame for this. In January, Urals stood at $67.66. Just to reiterate, it is now down to $44.87. One third of the value had drifted away, quietly, steadily, and without asking for permission to return. The price has not been this low since November 2020, when oil markets and Russian television were both competing for the world's most stressful viewing experience. The decline in Urals is not just a line on a chart. It shows how sustained pressure is narrowing the Kremlin's financial options. Lower export revenue means fewer resources available to sustain an expensive war and fewer tools to stabilize things back at home. It is not a dramatic collapse, but a slow shift in direction Moscow keeps insisting does not exist. But the longer it continues, the harder it is to pretend otherwise. But don't tell any of that to Vlad. Watching him walk off the cliff along with the entire Russian economy beats any show streaming on Netflix, I kid you not. And with this we conclude this episode of Break the Fake. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.